Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a kitchen that smells like percolating coffee, warm formica, and the faint metallic tang of aluminum cookware fresh from the dishpan. We are talking about the 1960s American kitchen, specifically all those products that filled every drawer, lined every cabinet, and sat faithfully on every countertop. Tools and gadgets that were once as common as morning light, but have now vanished so completely you would need a time machine or a very patient grandmother to find them. Before we dive in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these strange little journeys into the everyday magic of the past. And thank you, truly, to the viewer who suggested this topic. You always send me the best ideas, the ones that make me pause and think, yes, that is exactly the kind of nostalgia we need right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I know someone out there is listening at 2:37 a.m, eating crackers in bed, confidently pretending this counts as productive wind down time. Also, the channel is now live on Spotify, so if you want to listen there, the link is in the description. No pressure, just another way to drift through history together. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise breeze, wiggle down under your blanket and get comfortable. Really comfortable. Like you're not moving for 8 hours unless there is a legitimate emergency involving smoke detectors. Because tonight we're exploring a kitchen that hummed with gadgets we have completely forgotten. Products that promised convenience, modernity, and a future where dinner practically made itself. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to open a 1960s kitchen cabinet? What sounds greeted you when you pulled out the cutlery drawer? What did those strange appliances smell like when they heated up? Did people actually use all those specialized tools, or did they sit quietly in drawers, waiting for a purpose that never quite arrived? What was it like cooking without a microwave, without a food processor, without the internet to tell you what paprika even was? Could you prepare a full Sunday dinner using only the tools your grandmother had? And more importantly, would you even recognize half of them? And just like that, it is 1965. The kitchen window is open, letting in the sound of a lawnmower 2 houses down. The formica countertop is cool beneath your hand. The percolator gurgles on the stove, and tucked into every drawer, every cupboard, every corner of this room are products that once promised the future, but have now become gentle ghosts of the past. Let us start with the morning, because mornings in the 1960s began with the sound you could set your internal clock by, the rhythmic bubbling of the electric percolator. This machine sat proudly on the kitchen counter, chrome and glass gurgling away like a small caffeinated heartbeat. It was not quiet, it was not subtle, but it was dependable, and in a decade obsessed with electric convenience, that was enough. The percolator worked in a way that felt almost magical if you did not think about it too hard. Cold water went into the bottom chamber, electricity heated it, and then boiling water shot up through a small tube, splashing over the coffee grounds in the basket at the top. The cycle repeated, over and over, each bubble visible through the glass knob on the lid, a tiny amber fountain that told you coffee was happening. You could watch it if you wanted, standing there in your bathrobe, mesmerized by the rhythm, the reliability, the promise of caffeine slowly building in that chrome pot. The smell filled the kitchen first, rich and bitter and unmistakably morning. It crept through the hallway, drifted upstairs, woke the children before you had to call them twice. Coffee made in a percolator tasted different than what would come later. Stronger, heavier, with a slight metallic edge from the aluminum basket. Some people loved it. Some people tolerated it. Everyone drank it anyway. Because this was simply what coffee was. You learned to time it, to listen for the moment when the bubbling slowed, when the sound shifted from urgent to lazy, signalling that the brewing was nearly done. If you left it too long, the coffee grew bitter, harsh, punishing. If you pulled it too soon, it was weak, pale, disappointing. There was an art to it. A quiet negotiation between patience and attention. The percolator sat on the counter all day, often still plugged in, keeping the coffee warm in a way that gradually turned it into something closer to motor oil than a beverage. But you poured another cup anyway, adding milk, adding sugar, stirring it with a spoon that clinked against the ceramic in a sound as familiar as your own heartbeat. Cleaning it was its own ritual. You unscrewed the basket, dumped the wet grounds into the trash, rinsed the parts in the sink. The glass knob sometimes cracked if you were not careful, and replacement knobs became a strange currency among neighbours, traded like small favours. The pot itself grew stained over time, dark rings forming inside, proof of 1,000 mornings, 1,000 cups, 1,000 quiet moments standing at the counter waiting for the day to begin. And then, slowly, the percolator began to disappear. Drip coffee makers arrived, quieter, easier, promising a cleaner taste and less effort. The microwave oven made reheating yesterday's coffee possible, eliminating the need to keep a pot warm all day. Instant coffee grew more popular, faster still, requiring nothing but hot water and surrender. But for those who remember, the percolator remains the sound of morning, the smell of home, the gentle bubbling promise that today, like yesterday, would begin with something warm and familiar. It was not just a machine. It was the heartbeat of the kitchen, steady and reliable, gurgling away while the rest of the house slowly woke to meet the day. You reach into the drawer and pull out the rotary egg beater, a hand-cranked marvel of gears and determination. This tool required no batteries, no outlet, no electricity at all, just your wrist, your patience, and a willingness to believe that 3 minutes of cranking would eventually produce stiff peaks. The mechanism whirred softly, a comforting metallic purr, and your arm did all the work that stand mixers would later claim as their own. The design was simple, almost elegant in its mechanical honesty. 2 beaters, wire loops twisted into tight spirals, spun when you turned the hand crank on the side. Gears inside the handle translated your motion into speed, and if you cranked fast enough, the beaters blurred into a silver whirlwind. You held the handle in one hand, the bowl steady with the other, and you cranked, rhythmically, persistently, until your shoulder began to quietly protest. Beating egg whites was the ultimate test. You started with clear, viscous liquid that sloshed lazily in the bowl, and you cranked, watching as tiny bubbles formed, multiplied, grew. The eggs transformed slowly, reluctantly, from liquid to foam, from foam to soft clouds, and finally, if you had the stamina, into glossy peaks that held their shape when you lifted the beaters. It took time, it took effort, but there was something deeply satisfying about earning your meringue through sheer persistence. The sound was part of the experience, that soft whirring click of metal gears meshing, the gentle scrape of wire against ceramic, the gradual change in pitch as the mixture thickened. You could hear the progress, feel it in the resistance against your hand. Thin batters spun easily, barely tugging at the mechanism. Thick doughs fought back, demanding more force, more determination, more willingness to ignore the ache building in your forearm. Children loved the rotary beater, or at least they loved it for the first 30 seconds before realizing how much work it actually required. You handed it to them when making cookies, let them crank until their enthusiasm faded, then quietly took over, finishing the job while they wandered off to do something less exhausting. It taught a small lesson about effort and reward, though no one said it out loud. The beaters themselves required cleaning, and this was where the design revealed its one flaw. Batter clung stubbornly to the wires, hiding in the tight spirals, requiring a brush, hot water, and patience to fully remove. You could not just toss it in the dishwasher, not that most homes had dishwashers yet anyway. You scrubbed it by hand, dried it carefully and returned it to the drawer, ready for the next time someone needed beaten eggs or whipped cream, or a reason to question their life choices. And then the electric hand mixers arrived, lighter, faster, requiring nothing but the press of a button. The rotary beater began its slow migration to the back of the drawer, used less frequently, eventually forgotten entirely. But it never broke. It never needed repairs. It simply waited, patient and mechanical, in case anyone ever needed to beat eggs the old-fashioned way again. For those who used it, the rotary egg beater remains a memory of effort, of the satisfying whir of gears, of standing at the counter cranking away while dinner waited, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something homemade, something earned, something made entirely by hand. Every 1960s household had one, whether they actually liked fondue or not. The fondue pot sat in the centre of the dining table, a cheerful little vessel of melted cheese or chocolate, surrounded by long forks and the unspoken understanding that someone was definitely going to drop their bread cube into the bubbling centre and lose it forever. It was novelty. It was entertainment. It was dinner theatre for people who did not leave the house. The pot itself was usually ceramic or enamelled metal, brightly coloured, sitting atop a small stand with a burner underneath. You lit the burner, a tiny flame fed by a can of gel fuel that smelled faintly chemical and vaguely dangerous, and you adjusted it carefully, hoping to maintain the perfect temperature where cheese stayed melted but did not scorch. It was a delicate balance, one that required more attention than anyone wanted to admit. Cheese fondue was the classic, a bubbling mixture of Gruyere, white wine and garlic, though many American versions substituted cheddar and beer because Gruyere was expensive and wine felt fancy in a way that made some guests uncomfortable. You melted the cheese slowly, stirring it with a wooden spoon, watching it transform from shredded pieces into a smooth, glossy pool. Then you called everyone to the table, handed out the long fondue forks, and encouraged them to spear cubes of bread and dip. The problem was that fondue required participation. You could not simply serve it and walk away. Everyone had to engage, had to hover over the pot, had to navigate the social choreography of not tangling forks or hogging the best bread cubes. It was interactive dining, which sounded fun in theory, but often meant someone's bread fell off their fork and sank to the bottom of the pot, irretrievable, mourned briefly, and then forgotten. Children loved fondue for about 4 minutes, until the novelty wore off and they realised they were essentially eating melted cheese with extra steps. Adults loved it because it felt sophisticated, European, like something you might experience at a ski lodge in Switzerland rather than a ranch house in Ohio. It made dinner feel like an event, even if the event was slightly chaotic and involved a lot of reaching across the table. Chocolate fondue was the dessert version, sweeter, easier, more forgiving. You melted chocolate chips with a bit of cream, arranged strawberries, banana slices and marshmallows on a platter, and let everyone dip to their heart's content. The chocolate cooled faster than cheese, hardening into a thin shell on the fruit, and if you waited too long between dips, you had to scrape your fork against the bottom to loosen the solidified chocolate. But no one complained. Chocolate fondue was joy in a pot, messy and indulgent and entirely worth the sticky fingers. And then, as quickly as it arrived, fondue fell out of fashion. The pots were tucked into cabinets, the long forks relegated to junk drawers, the gel fuel canisters discarded or left to gather dust in the garage. Fondue became a punchline, a relic of a decade that thought melted cheese at the dinner table was the height of sophistication. But for those who remember, fondue night was special, a break from the ordinary, a meal that required everyone to gather close, to laugh when someone dropped their bread, to linger at the table longer than usual because the cheese was still melting and the conversation was still flowing. It was not just dinner. It was an experience, however briefly it lasted, however quickly it faded into memory. Your cabinets overflow with Tupperware, pastel-coloured containers with lids that burp when sealed, a sound so satisfying it borders on spiritual. These were not just storage containers. They were status symbols, proof that you attended the right parties, knew the right neighbours, and understood that leftovers deserved dignity. You could date a household by the colour of their Tupperware, and everyone did. Tupperware arrived in the 1950s but truly exploded in the 60s, spreading through suburban America like a friendly organised wildfire. The products were revolutionary, airtight seals that actually worked, durable plastic that did not crack or stain, and a burping feature that made sealing leftovers feel like a small household victory. You pressed the lid down, watched the air escape through the small opening, then snapped it shut with a satisfying click. The burp meant it was sealed. The burp meant your food would stay fresh. The burp meant you were doing everything right. But Tupperware was more than just containers. It was a social network, a business model, a reason for women to gather in living rooms and talk about something other than children and laundry. Tupperware parties became events, hosted by a friend or neighbour who invited a dozen women over, served snacks, demonstrated the products, and encouraged everyone to order. It was sales, yes, but it was also community, an excuse to dress up, to chat, to admire someone else's living room, and compare notes on the best way to store celery. The colours were soft, optimistic, carefully chosen to match the pastel kitchens of the era. Pale yellow, mint green, coral pink, powder blue, each piece nested inside the next, a satisfying Russian doll of practicality. You stacked them in your cabinet, organised by size or colour or some system only you understood, and you felt a small surge of pride every time you opened the door and saw them lined up like little plastic soldiers. Using Tupperware meant you were modern, efficient, forward-thinking. You did not wrap leftovers in wax paper or cover bowls with plates. You used containers specifically designed for the job. Containers with lids that sealed, that stacked, that kept food fresh longer than anything your grandmother had in her kitchen. It was progress in plastic form and it felt good. The lids, of course, were the eternal problem. They went missing. They wandered off to some mysterious dimension where single socks and pen caps also disappeared. You had containers without lids, lids without containers, and a growing sense that the universe was conspiring against your organisational efforts. You tried to match them, digging through the cabinet, testing lids on different bases, hoping for a fit that never quite came. Some households gave up entirely and used aluminum foil. Others committed to the search, determined to reunite every orphaned lid with its rightful home. Tupperware also became a form of social currency. You lent containers to neighbours, sent food home with guests, and then waited, sometimes for months, to get your containers back. There was an unspoken understanding that borrowed Tupperware should be returned, preferably washed, ideally filled with something homemade as a gesture of gratitude. But it did not always happen. Some containers never came home, living out their days in someone else's cabinet, far from the kitchen where they were purchased. And yet, despite the missing lids, despite the occasional container that absorbed the smell of onions and refused to let it go, Tupperware endured. It became part of the household landscape, as essential as dishes or silverware. You stored leftovers, you packed lunches, you organised pantry staples, and you did it all in cheerful pastel plastic that made even the most mundane task feel just a little bit special. Because Tupperware was not really about containers. It was about caring for your family, about reducing waste, about keeping food fresh and your kitchen organised. It was about being the kind of person who had their life together enough to own matching storage containers. And in the 1960s, that was something worth burping about. The electric can opener had arrived by the mid-60s, but many kitchens still kept the manual version tucked in a drawer, a sturdy metal tool with a crank handle and a sharp circular blade. Opening a can required effort, coordination, and occasionally a small prayer that the blade would not slip and send you to the emergency room. It was reliable, simple, and completely unforgiving of mistakes. The manual can opener was a marvel of mechanical simplicity. You positioned the blade on the rim of the can, squeezed the handles together to pierce the metal, then turned the crank handle to guide the blade around the edge. The cutting wheel bit into the tin with a satisfying crunch, and if you kept steady pressure and maintained a consistent rhythm, the lid separated cleanly, curling slightly as it came free. If you rushed, if you lost focus, the blade jumped off the rim and you had to start over, repositioning, re-piercing, trying again. It required two hands, both working in coordination. One hand squeezed the handles, keeping the blade engaged with the can. The other hand cranked, slowly, steadily, feeling the resistance of metal against metal. Your wrist did most of the work, rotating in small circles, and if the can was large or the contents dense, your forearm began to ache before you finished. But you kept going, because stopping halfway meant a jagged edge and a can that refused to open properly. The sound was distinctive, a grinding, scraping noise that cut through kitchen conversations and announced to everyone within earshot that someone was opening a can. It was not pleasant exactly, but it was purposeful, a working sound, the kind of noise that meant dinner was progressing, that ingredients were being accessed, that someone was making something from scratch, even if that something started with a can of tomato paste. Children were rarely allowed to use the manual can opener unsupervised. The blade was sharp, the mechanism unforgiving, and the potential for injury real enough that most parents kept it out of reach, until their children were old enough to understand consequences. Learning to use it was a small rite of passage, a sign that you were trusted with tools that could actually hurt you if you were careless. The manual opener also revealed the truth about canned goods. The lids were sharp. Once removed, the metal edge could slice skin with alarming ease, and the lid itself, now separated but still sitting on top of the can, posed its own danger. You lifted it carefully, using a fork or your fingers, and dropped it into the trash, mindful of the jagged circle of tin that had moments ago sealed your green beans or your soup or your condensed milk. Some manual openers lasted for decades, passed down through families, their handles worn smooth from years of use, their blades still sharp enough to bite through metal. Others broke, the gears stripping, the handles bending, the blade dulling until it could no longer pierce the can and had to be replaced. But even when they broke, people hesitated to throw them away, tucking them back in the drawer as backup just in case the electric opener stopped working, or the power went out, or the future required manual effort once again. And then, gradually, the manual can opener faded. Electric openers became standard, easier, faster, requiring nothing but the press of a button. Pull-tab cans arrived, eliminating the need for openers entirely. The manual version migrated to the back of the drawer, behind the potato peeler and the garlic press, still functional but rarely used. A relic of a time when opening a can required both effort and attention. But for those who used it, the manual can opener remains a memory of simpler mechanics, of the satisfying grind of blade on metal, of standing at the counter cranking away while dinner simmered on the stove, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something homemade. Something that started with a can but ended with care. No 1960s kitchen was complete without a collection of Jell-O molds, in shapes that defied both logic and appetite. Bunt-style rings, fish-shaped molds, fluted towers, each one designed to turn flavoured gelatin into something vaguely architectural. You filled them with jello, sometimes with fruit suspended inside, sometimes with vegetables if you were feeling experimental or slightly unhinged, and then you unmoulded them onto a platter and hoped for the best. Jello moulds were made of aluminum, copper or tin, heavy and solid, with intricate designs pressed into the interior. A ring mould with scalloped edges, a fish with scales and fins, a star, a flower, a geometric pattern that promised to transform your dessert into a work of art. You greased them lightly, usually with a thin layer of oil or a quick spray of non-stick coating, though non-stick spray was still a few years away and most people just used their fingers and a bottle of vegetable oil, hoping it would be enough. Making moulded jello required patience and faith. You mixed the gelatin powder with boiling water, stirred until it dissolved completely, then added cold water and whatever additions seemed appropriate. Canned fruit. Cocktail was popular. The tiny cubes of peach and pear and that one mysterious red cherry suspended in sweetness. Shredded carrots appeared in savoury versions along with celery, onions and sometimes mayonnaise, though calling that combination salad required a generous interpretation of the word. You poured the mixture into the mould carefully, trying not to disturb the fruit or vegetables already settling at the bottom. Then you placed it in the refrigerator and waited. Jello needed time, hours of cold stillness to firm up from liquid into its signature wobble. You checked it periodically, testing the surface with your finger, waiting for it to feel solid enough to unmould without collapsing into a puddle of regret. The unmoulding was the moment of truth. You filled the sink with warm water, dipped the mould briefly, just long enough to loosen the gelatin from the metal, but not long enough to melt it. Then you placed a plate on top, held your breath, flipped the whole thing over and prayed. Sometimes it worked beautifully, the jello sliding free in one perfect, glistening dome. Sometimes it stuck, requiring coaxing, gentle shaking, or a second dip in warm water, and sometimes it simply refused, clinging stubbornly to the mould until you had to dig it out with a spoon and pretend you meant to serve it that way. When it worked, when the mould released cleanly and the jello stood tall and wobbling on the platter, it was a triumph. You carried it to the table with pride, this strange shimmering creation that looked like something from a science fiction film but tasted like childhood and sugar. Guests admired it, or at least pretended to, and everyone took a slice, watching it jiggle on their plates, the fruit suspended inside like specimens in a very delicious laboratory. Jello salads were their own category, savoury gelatin dishes that appeared at potlucks and holiday dinners, often containing ingredients that had no business being combined. Lime jello with cottage cheese and pineapple, orange jello with grated carrots and raisins, lemon jello with tuna and celery. These were real recipes, published in magazines, tested in kitchens, served to families who ate them without complaint because this was simply what people did in the 1960s, and then tastes changed. Jello moulds began to feel dated, a little too earnest, a little too strange. The moulds were tucked into cabinets, stored in basements, eventually donated to thrift stores where they sat on shelves, waiting for someone nostalgic enough to buy them. But they never truly disappeared, because every few years someone rediscovers them, dusts them off, and makes a moulded jello salad for a retro-themed party, or a laugh, or a reminder of what dinner used to look like when creativity meant suspending vegetables in gelatin and calling it modern. Pyrex bowls, in their rainbow of primary colours stacked neatly in every cupboard. Red, yellow, green, blue. These bowls were indestructible, heat-proof and utterly reliable. You mixed cookie dough in them, tossed salads in them, stored leftovers in them, and if you were particularly resourceful, used them as makeshift hats during particularly dull afternoons. They were the workhorses of the kitchen, humble and unbreakable. The bowls came in sets, graduated sizes that nested inside one another for compact storage. The smallest held a cup or two, perfect for beating an egg or mixing a small batch of frosting. The largest could accommodate an entire cake batter, a mountain of mashed potatoes, or a salad big enough to feed a dozen people. Each bowl was smooth, glossy, satisfyingly heavy in your hands, the glass thick enough to withstand decades of use without chipping or cracking. The colours were not decorative. They were identifying markers, a visual language that let you grab the right bowl without thinking. You needed the big yellow one for bread dough, the medium green one for pancake batter, the small red one for whisking eggs. Over time, each bowl developed its own role, its own purpose, and you reached for them automatically, guided by colour and habit rather than conscious thought. Pyrex glass was designed to handle temperature changes that would shatter ordinary glass. You could fill a bowl with ice water, then pour boiling liquid into it moments later, and the glass would not crack. You could take a bowl straight from the refrigerator and place it in a warm oven, and it would heat evenly, gently, without breaking. This was revolutionary practical magic that made cooking easier and gave you one less thing to worry about. The bowls were also beautiful in their simplicity. No patterns, no decoration, just solid blocks of colour in a glossy finish that caught the light. They looked modern, cheerful, optimistic, a small burst of brightness in kitchens that were often beige or white or pale yellow. They made even the most mundane tasks feel just a little more pleasant, a little more intentional. Children loved the Pyrex bowls, though usually for reasons unrelated to cooking. The bowls became boats in the bathtub, helmets for imaginative play, drums when turned upside down and tapped with a wooden spoon. They were sturdy enough to survive being dropped, though not from great heights, and light enough for small hands to carry without too much difficulty. Parents tolerated this because Pyrex was meant to be used, meant to be functional, and if that function occasionally involved pretending to be a space explorer wearing a green glass helmet, so be it. The bowls were easy to clean, a quick rinse and a wipe, and they emerged spotless, ready for the next task. They did not absorb odours or stains, did not retain the ghost of yesterday's onions or last week's marinara sauce. They were neutral, reliable, endlessly reusable, and they lasted. Some families still have their original Pyrex bowls, decades old, still bright, still smooth, still perfectly functional. They have outlasted marriages, moved across the country multiple times, been passed down to children and grandchildren, and they continue to do exactly what they were designed to do. Hold things, mix things, make cooking easier. Because Pyrex bowls were not fancy, they were not expensive, they were not trying to be anything other than what they were: simple, colourful, indestructible tools that made life in the kitchen a little bit easier, a little bit brighter, and a lot more reliable. And in a decade obsessed with gadgets and convenience, that kind of quiet dependability was worth more than all the electric appliances combined. Before plastic took over, ice cube trays were made of aluminum, with a lever mechanism that cracked the ice free when you pulled it. The process was oddly satisfying, a metallic snap followed by the clatter of cubes tumbling into your glass. These trays lived in the freezer, growing a thin layer of frost over time, and they required a certain finesse to operate without sending ice skittering across the kitchen floor. The aluminum trays were simple in design but clever in execution. A rectangular tray divided into individual cube compartments, with a long lever running down the centre. You filled the tray with water carefully, trying not to overfill because water expands when it freezes, and overfilled trays created ice mountains that fused multiple cubes into one stubborn block. Then you placed it in the freezer and waited several hours for the water to freeze solid. Removing the ice was the satisfying part. You gripped the tray in one hand, positioned it over a glass or a bowl, and pulled the lever. The mechanism underneath lifted the dividers slightly, cracking the ice free from the aluminum with a series of sharp metallic pops. If you pulled too gently, nothing happened. If you pulled too hard, the entire contents of the tray launched into the air like frozen projectiles, cubes bouncing off the counter, skidding across the floor, disappearing under the refrigerator where they would slowly melt into mysterious puddles. The key was a firm, steady pull, confident but controlled, and after a few uses you developed the touch, the exact amount of force required to release the ice without creating chaos. Children were fascinated by the lever, begging to be allowed to pull it, and parents usually let them try once before realizing that children lacked the fine motor control required, and the cleanup was not worth the educational experience. The aluminum trays were also cold, painfully so, and grabbing one with bare hands straight from the freezer was a mistake you only made once. The metal stuck slightly to your skin, a brief but unpleasant sensation that made you wish you had thought to use a dish towel. Over time, a thin layer of frost built up on the exterior, fuzzy and white, insulating the tray slightly but also making it look like it belonged in an Arctic research station rather than a suburban kitchen. Refilling the trays was a daily chore in households that used ice regularly, which was most of them. You pulled the tray out, filled it at the sink, carried it carefully back to the freezer, trying not to slosh water over the edges, then slid it back into place. Some freezers had special slots designed to hold the trays level. Others required you to balance them on top of frozen vegetables or wedge them between packages of meat, hoping they would not tip and spill before the water froze. The ice cubes themselves were never quite perfect. The corners were slightly rounded, the surfaces sometimes cloudy from minerals in the water, and occasionally an air bubble froze inside, creating a weak spot that made the cube crack unexpectedly when you dropped it into your drink. But they were ice cold and functional, and that was all that mattered. And then plastic trays arrived. Lighter, easier to twist, less prone to sticking. The aluminum trays began to disappear, replaced by flexible plastic that you could bend to release the ice without the need for a lever. The satisfying metallic snap was gone, replaced by a softer, quieter crack. But the convenience was undeniable. Still, for those who remember, the aluminum ice cube tray remains a small but vivid memory. The cold metal against your hands, the sharp snap of the lever, the clatter of ice cubes tumbling into your glass on a summer afternoon. It was simple, mechanical, reliable. A small piece of everyday magic that made cold drinks possible before automatic ice makers turned frozen water into something you never had to think about again. Corningware, with its signature cornflower blue pattern, was the backbone of 1960s dinners. These dishes went from stovetop to oven to table without complaint, carrying casseroles, pot roasts, and the occasional experimental recipe that seemed like a good idea at the time. They were elegant enough for company, practical enough for Tuesday, and sturdy enough to survive decades of use without chipping. The material was a revelation, a glass-ceramic hybrid that could withstand extreme temperature changes without cracking. You could simmer a sauce directly on the burner, then transfer the same dish into a hot oven to finish cooking, and the Corningware handled it without protest. This was convenience disguised as elegance, a dish that reduced the number of pots and pans you needed, simplified cleanup, and looked presentable enough to bring straight to the table. The cornflower blue pattern became iconic, delicate blue flowers on a white background, simple but recognizable, printed on every piece. It was not flashy. It was not trying too hard. It was quietly tasteful, the kind of pattern that worked for both weeknight dinners and holiday gatherings, that matched every tablecloth and coordinated with every kitchen colour scheme. People collected it, not obsessively, but steadily. adding pieces over time until they had a full set. Casseroles were the natural home for Corningware, layered dishes that combined starches, proteins, vegetables and canned soup into something warm and filling. Tuna noodle casserole, chicken and rice, green bean casserole with the crispy fried onions on top, shepherd's pie. These were weeknight staples, dishes that fed families without requiring much skill or attention, and Corningware was the vessel that made them possible. You assembled the casserole in the dish, spreading each layer evenly, then covered it with a matching glass lid or a sheet of aluminum foil. It slid into the oven, baking slowly, filling the house with the smell of something comforting, something familiar. When it was done, you pulled it out, set it on a trivet and brought it directly to the table, serving from the same dish it cooked in. Fewer dishes to wash. Less time spent transferring food, more time spent eating. The handles on the sides were small but functional, 2 moulded grips that stayed cool enough to touch even when the dish was hot. You grabbed them with pot holders, lifted carefully, carried the dish across the kitchen with the confidence of someone who knew it would not crack, would not slip, would not betray you in any way. Corningware also reheated beautifully. You stored leftovers in the same dish, covered it with plastic wrap or the glass lid, tucked it into the refrigerator, then reheated it the next day directly in the oven or on the stovetop. The glass ceramic material distributed heat evenly, preventing hot spots, preventing burning, making leftovers taste nearly as good as they did the first time, and it lasted. Corningware did not chip easily, did not crack from normal use, didn't wear out after a few years. It survived moves, survived children, survived decades of daily cooking, and it remained functional, reliable, as sturdy as the day it was purchased. Some pieces developed stains over time, dark spots on the white surface from years of baking casseroles and roasting meats, but the stains were proof of use, proof of a life spent feeding families and bringing people together over simple, hearty meals. Eventually, newer materials arrived, lighter dishes, colourful dishes, dishes that promised even better heat distribution or easier cleaning. But Corningware endured, tucked into cabinets, still pulled out for casseroles and potlucks, still dependable after all these years, because Corningware was not about trends or fashion. It was about function, about reliability, about a dish that did its job quietly and well, without demanding attention or praise. It was the backbone of the kitchen, steady and unassuming, making dinner possible night after night, year after year, decade after decade. The electric knife arrived in the 60s like a miracle from the future. This buzzing, vibrating blade promised to carve roasts, slice bread, and generally make you feel like a culinary wizard. In reality, it was loud, slightly terrifying, and required the kind of focus usually reserved for defusing bombs. But it worked, and that was enough to earn it a permanent spot in the gadget drawer. The knife consisted of 2 serrated blades that moved back and forth in rapid oscillation, sawing through meat or bread with minimal effort from the user. You plugged it in, pressed the button on the handle, and the blade sprang to life with a high-pitched whir that announced to everyone in the house that something important was being carved. The sound was aggressive, mechanical, unsettling in the way that all early electric appliances were unsettling before we grew accustomed to machines doing the work our hands once did. Using the electric knife required confidence. You positioned the blades on the surface of the roast, pressed the button, and guided it slowly through the meat, letting the blades do the cutting while you provided direction. If you pressed too hard, the motor strained. If you moved too fast, the slices came out uneven. The trick was a light touch and steady motion, allowing the vibration to do the work while you maintained control. Carving the Thanksgiving turkey became easier, or at least faster, with the electric knife. You slice through breast meat in smooth, even cuts, the blades gliding through cooked poultry like it was offering no resistance at all. The slices were uniform, presentable, the kind of carving that made you look competent even if you had no idea what you were doing. Fathers often took charge of the electric knife, standing at the head of the table, wielding it like a scepter, carving with the ceremonial gravity of someone operating important machinery. Bread was another popular use. The electric knife cut through crusty loaves without crushing the soft interior, producing even slices that held together beautifully. It worked especially well on homemade bread, where a regular knife sometimes compressed the loaf or tore the crumb, but the electric knife sawed cleanly, preserving the structure. Slicing bread became faster, more efficient, and just a little bit more fun. But the electric knife also had limitations. It was loud, uncomfortably so, and using it meant conversations paused, televisions were muted, and everyone waited for the carving to finish before resuming whatever they had been doing. It was also slightly dangerous, the rapidly moving blades capable of cutting through more than just meat if you were careless. You kept your fingers well away from the business end, held the handle firmly, and never let children near it unsupervised. Cleaning was another challenge. The blades detached from the handle, which was convenient for washing, but they remained sharp, serrated, and capable of nicking your fingers if you were not careful. You washed them by hand, dried them thoroughly, and stored them back in the protective sleeve or slid them into the drawer with caution, mindful of anyone who might reach in later without looking. And yet, despite the noise, despite the slight danger, the electric knife became a fixture in many kitchens. It represented progress, modernity, the promise that technology could make even the most traditional tasks easier. It sat in the drawer most of the year, waiting patiently for holidays and special occasions, for moments when carving mattered and presentation counted. Because the electric knife was not really about convenience. It was about ceremony, about standing at the head of the table with a humming blade in your hand, carving the roast while your family watched, proving that you could wield modern technology and ancient tradition at the same time, slicing through meat with mechanical precision while maintaining the ritual that had brought families together for generations. Spice racks in the 1960s were small, tidy, and filled with jars that rarely saw use beyond salt, pepper, and the occasional adventurous dash of paprika. These racks hung on the wall or sat on the counter, their contents aging quietly into museum pieces. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves. They were there, just in case, gathering dust and waiting for the day someone decided to bake something ambitious. The racks themselves were often wooden, with small slots or shelves designed to hold uniform glass jars, each one labelled in careful script or printed letters. Some racks came with the jars included, a complete set of 20 or 30 spices, most of which the average cook could not identify by smell or taste. Others were sold empty, waiting to be filled gradually as recipes demanded oregano or thyme or marjoram, spices that sounded sophisticated but rarely made it past the shopping list. The jars were small, holding perhaps an ounce or two, with metal lids that screwed on tightly, sometimes too tightly, requiring a dish towel and determination to open after months of disuse. Inside, the spices sat undisturbed, their colours fading slowly from vibrant to muted, their flavours weakening as time passed and air seeped in around the threads of the lid. Paprika turned from bright red to dull rust. Oregano faded from green to brown. Ground ginger clumped into hard little rocks that no amount of shaking could separate. Most households used only a handful of spices regularly. Salt and pepper were constants, essential. Reaching for them was automatic, a reflex built into every recipe. Garlic powder appeared in savoury dishes, onion powder followed close behind, and Italian seasoning, a pre-mixed blend that saved you from having to stock basil, oregano, and rosemary separately, covered most pasta sauces and casseroles. Beyond that, the spice rack was mostly decoration, a symbol of culinary potential rather than actual practice. Baking required a few more: cinnamon for cookies and cakes, nutmeg for pies and custards, cloves for holiday hams and spiced cider. These jars saw use once or twice a year, pulled down during the Christmas season, or when someone decided to make pumpkin pie from scratch, then return to the rack where they resumed their quiet wait for the next occasion. Some spices never got used at all. Turmeric sat unopened, purchased because a recipe in a magazine called for it, but that recipe was never made and the jar remained sealed, its bright yellow powder visible through the glass but forever inaccessible. Cardamom, mace, fenugreek. These were exotic, mysterious, intimidating in their unfamiliarity. They sat on the rack like guests at a party who never got invited into the conversation, present but ignored. The spice rack also revealed aspirations. A well-stocked rack suggested that you were adventurous, capable of cooking dishes beyond the standard rotation of meatloaf and pot roast. It hinted at international flavours, at recipes from faraway places, at a willingness to experiment. But in reality, most of those jars were aspirational purchases, bought with good intentions and then forgotten, their contents slowly losing potency while you continue to cook the same familiar meals with the same familiar seasonings. Occasionally, someone would clean out the spice rack, pulling down each jar, checking dates if there were any, sniffing contents to determine if they still smelled like anything recognizable. Expired spices were thrown away, empty slots were filled with new jars, and for a brief moment the rack looked fresh, organized, ready for culinary adventures. But within weeks, the pattern resumed. The same few jars getting used, the others returning to their decorative role. Because the spice rack was not really about spices, it was about the idea of cooking, the promise that someday, when you had time and energy and inspiration, you would make something extraordinary, something that required cardamom or turmeric or mace. And until that day came, the jars would wait, patient and dusty, ready for the moment when ordinary cooking became something more. The pressure cooker sat on the stove like a small, intimidating rocket, hissing and rattling as it cooked food faster than any ordinary pot could manage. It was efficient, modern, and slightly dangerous, at least in the minds of anyone who had heard a horror story about a pressure cooker incident. You respected it, you used it carefully, and you never ever opened it before the pressure fully released. The design was industrial, heavy-gauge aluminum or stainless steel, with a thick lid that locked into place with lugs and grooves, creating an airtight seal. A weighted valve sat on top, regulating the pressure inside, rocking gently when the cooker reached temperature, releasing steam in rhythmic bursts that sounded like a sleeping dragon. A rubber gasket lined the lid, crucial for maintaining the seal, and you replaced it regularly because a worn gasket meant lost pressure, longer cooking times, and the potential for disaster. Using a pressure cooker required following instructions precisely. You added food and liquid, never filling it more than 2/3 full because expanding steam needed space. You locked the lid, checked that the valve was clear, then placed it on the burner over high heat. As the contents heated, pressure built inside, steam accumulated, and eventually the weighted valve began to jiggle, releasing excess pressure in short, sharp bursts. That jiggling was your signal to reduce the heat, maintaining just enough temperature to keep the pressure steady without letting it climb too high. The pressure inside the cooker was substantial, 15 pounds per square inch, hot enough to raise the boiling point of water well above 212 degrees. This meant food cooked faster, much faster. A pot roast that normally required 3 hours in the oven was done in 45 minutes. Dried beans, which usually needed hours of simmering, softened in 30 minutes. Tough cuts of meat became tender, vegetables cooked through, and dinner happened on a schedule that felt almost miraculous. But the pressure cooker demanded respect. You never forced the lid open. You waited for the pressure to drop naturally, listening for the silence that meant the steam had dissipated, or you used the quick release method, carefully moving the valve to vent the remaining steam in a dramatic whoosh that sent hot vapour shooting toward the ceiling. Only then, when the pressure indicator dropped and the safety lock disengaged, did you unlock the lid, lifting it away from you so the remaining steam did not scald your face. Stories circulated about pressure cookers exploding, lids rocketing across kitchens, contents splattering across walls and ceilings. Most of these stories were exaggerations or the result of user error, overfilling, blocked valves, forcing the lid open before the pressure released. But the stories persisted, adding an element of danger to what was otherwise just a very effective cooking method. People approach pressure cookers with caution, following the instructions to the letter, never improvising, never taking shortcuts. Despite the intimidation factor, pressure cookers were popular, especially among busy families who needed dinner on the table quickly. Working mothers relied on them, loading the cooker in the morning or during lunch breaks, knowing that when they returned home, a hot meal would be ready in less than an hour. The speed was undeniable, the results consistently good, and the slight danger only added to the sense that you were using advanced technology, rather than just a pot with a tight lid. Cleaning the pressure cooker was straightforward but essential. You washed the pot, scrubbed the lid, inspected the gasket for cracks or wear, and checked that the valve was clear, using a toothpick to dislodge any food particles that might have blocked the steam vent. Proper maintenance kept the cooker safe and functional, and most households treated it with the same care they gave to any tool that could theoretically cause harm if misused. And then slow cookers arrived, less intimidating, less noisy, requiring nothing but time rather than pressure. Pressure cookers faded, tucked into cabinets, used less frequently, eventually forgotten. But for those who mastered them, who learned to listen for the jiggle of the valve and trust the process, pressure cookers remain a memory of efficient cooking, of meals prepared faster than seemed possible, of standing in the kitchen listening to the gentle hiss and rattle, knowing that dinner was happening inside that sealed chamber, transformed by heat and pressure into something tender and ready to eat. Every counter had a bread box, a metal or wooden container designed to keep bread fresh and protected from the elements. It sat there, reliable and unassuming, doing its one job with quiet dignity. You opened it in the morning to retrieve slices for toast, in the afternoon for sandwich assembly, and in the evening to check if there was enough left for tomorrow. It was simple, practical, and utterly obsolete in the age of plastic bags and preservatives. The bread box was usually rectangular, large enough to hold a full loaf plus a few rolls or a half-eaten package of hamburger buns. The front panel lifted or slid open, revealing the interior where bread sat unwrapped or loosely wrapped in wax paper, protected from air and pests but still able to breathe. Metal bread boxes were common, painted in colours that match kitchen decor, pale yellow, mint green, white with floral decals. Wooden ones were simpler, stained or left natural, with a hinged lid and sometimes a small window in front so you could see inside without opening it. Bread in the 60s did not last as long as modern bread. It contained fewer preservatives, less sugar, less of the chemical wizardry that keeps grocery store loaves soft for weeks. Fresh bread from the bakery or homemade bread baked in your own oven was delicious but perishable, starting to stale within a day or two, hardening by the third day, developing mould by the fourth if you were unlucky. The bread box slowed this process, not by much, but enough to buy you an extra day, maybe 2, before the bread became toast-only material or breadcrumbs. The bread box also protected against kitchen hazards. Flies, ants, mice, all were deterred by the closed container, unable to reach the bread inside. In homes without air conditioning, where windows stayed open and screens were the only barrier between inside and outside, this protection mattered. A loaf left uncovered on the counter invited trouble. A loaf in the bread box stayed safe, or safer anyway. Opening the bread box became a small daily ritual. You lifted the lid, or slid the door open, reached inside, pulled out the loaf, tore off a slice or two, then returned the rest and closed it again. The motion was automatic, comforting, part of the rhythm of kitchen life. The bread box smelled faintly of yeast and grain, a warm, slightly sweet aroma that meant home, that meant breakfast, that meant someone had thought to buy or bake bread so the household would not go hungry. Children were often sent to fetch bread from the bread box, a simple task that required no supervision and made them feel helpful. They opened the box, counted the slices to see if there was enough for everyone, reported back to the adult in charge. Sometimes they sneaked an extra slice, eating it plain while standing at the counter, tearing off small pieces and chewing slowly, savouring the soft texture and mild flavour. The bread box also collected odds and ends, a half sleeve of crackers, a few leftover dinner rolls, occasionally a package of English muffins or a lone bagel someone bought and forgot about. It became a general repository for baked goods, not just bread, and opening it sometimes revealed surprises, things you did not remember buying, things that were definitely past their prime. And then plastic bread bags became standard, pre-sliced loaves sold in airtight packaging that kept bread soft longer without needing a special container. Twist ties and plastic clips sealed the bags, and bread could sit on the counter or in a drawer or even on top of the refrigerator without spoiling as quickly. The bread box became unnecessary, redundant, taking up counter space without earning its keep. People stopped using them, stopped buying them, eventually donated them or threw them away. Kitchens became streamlined, modern, less cluttered with single-purpose containers. Bread lived in its bag, on the counter or in the pantry, and the bread box became a relic, a reminder of a time when keeping food fresh required dedicated tools and daily attention. But for those who remember, the bread box remains a symbol of simpler routines, of reaching into the container every morning, of the smell of fresh bread mixed with metal or wood, of a kitchen where every item had its place and its purpose, where even something as ordinary as storing bread felt deliberate and cared for. The flour sifter, with its squeeze handle and rotating blades, was an essential tool for any baker. You filled it with flour, squeezed the handle rhythmically, and watched as fine white powder drifted down into your mixing bowl like culinary snow. It was tedious, yes, but it was also satisfying, a small ritual that promised lighter cakes and fluffier biscuits. Pre-sifted flour would eventually make this tool unnecessary, but in the 60s it was still earning its keep. The sifter was usually made of metal, tin or aluminum, cylindrical or cup-shaped, with a handle on one side and a mesh screen at the bottom. Inside, wire blades or a rotary mechanism broke up clumps and incorporated air into the flour as you squeezed or cranked. The motion was repetitive, squeeze-release, each cycle pushing a small amount of flour through the mesh, creating a light, airy pile below. Sifting served multiple purposes. It removed lumps that formed when flour absorbed moisture from the air. It aerated the flour, making it lighter, which meant it mixed more easily into batters and doughs without creating dense, heavy results. And it combined dry ingredients evenly, mixing flour with baking powder, salt, or cocoa powder so that every spoonful contained the same proportions. recipes called for sifted flour regularly. 1 cup sifted flour meant you measured after sifting, not before, because sifted flour was lighter, fluffier, took up more volume than unsifted. If you measured first and then sifted, you ended up with less flour than the recipe intended, and your cake came out different, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but always unpredictable. Following the recipe exactly meant sifting first, then measuring, or measuring, then sifting, depending on how the instruction was worded. Children sometimes helped with sifting, standing on chairs at the counter, gripping the handle with both small hands, squeezing as hard as they could while flour drifted down in uneven spurts. They loved watching the powder fall, the way it piled softly in the bowl, the way it puffed slightly when it landed. They squeezed too hard, too fast, and flour spilled over the edge of the bowl, dusting the counter, their clothes the floor. But it was harmless, easy to clean, and they felt like they were helping, contributing to the cake or the biscuits or whatever was being made. The sound of sifting was gentle, a soft metallic whisper as the blades rotated, a faint rustling as the flour passed through the mesh. It was a working sound, purposeful and calm, the kind of background noise that filled a kitchen on baking day, along with the hum of the oven and the clatter of mixing bowls. Cleaning the sifter was simple but important. Flour residue clung to the mesh and the blades, and if left unwashed, it hardened into a stubborn paste that required soaking to remove. You rinsed it under warm water, shook it gently to dislodge trapped flour, then left it to air dry completely before storing it. A damp sifter rusted, and rust contaminated the flour the next time you used it, adding metallic flecks to your batter that no one wanted to explain. The sifter lived in a drawer or a cabinet, often near the flour canister, ready to be pulled out whenever a recipe demanded sifted ingredients. It was one of those tools that saw regular use in households where baking was frequent, where cakes and biscuits and breads were made from scratch rather than purchased from the store. In homes where baking was rare, this sifter sat unused for months gathering dust, waiting patiently for the day someone decided to make something that required its particular kind of help. And then flour companies began pre-sifting their products, running the flour through industrial sifters before packaging it, removing lumps and aerating it so consumers no longer needed to do it themselves. Recipes adjusted, no longer calling for sifted flour, no longer requiring that extra step. Baking became faster, easier, less fussy, and the sifter became optional rather than essential. But for those who used it, the flour sifter remains a memory of patient preparation, of standing at the counter, squeezing the handle, watching the flour fall in soft white drifts, knowing that this small effort would make the cake lighter, the biscuits fluffier, the final result just a little bit better than it would have been without this simple, tedious, satisfying ritual. Entertaining in the 1960s meant serving chips and dip on a special divided platter, designed exactly for that purpose. The chips lived in the outer ring, the dip in the centre bowl, and the whole arrangement sat proudly on the coffee table like a beacon of hospitality. These platters came in ceramic, plastic, and occasionally something that looked like melted jewellery, and they were as essential to parties as the guests themselves. The design was practical, a large circular or oval tray with raised edges, surrounding a smaller bowl that nested in the centre. You filled the bowl with dip, onion dip made from a packet of soup, mix and sour cream, or maybe a more adventurous combination involving cream cheese and chives. Then you arranged chips around it, rippled potato chips that crunched satisfyingly, or corn chips if you were feeling southwestern, and you placed the whole thing on the coffee table where guests could reach it easily. The platter solved a problem that no one had consciously identified, but everyone appreciated once they saw it. Before the chip and dip platter, you served chips in a bowl and dip in another bowl, and guests had to juggle both. balancing a plate on their lap, dipping chips without dripping onto the carpet, managing napkins and drinks while trying to participate in conversation. The integrated platter streamlined everything, keeping the chips and dip together, reducing the number of dishes on the table, making the whole experience feel organized and intentional. The materials varied wildly. Ceramic platters were heavy, formal, often glazed in bright colors or decorated with mid-century patterns, atomic starbursts or abstract swirls. Plastic platters were lighter, cheaper, more casual, usually molded in solid colors, avocado green, harvest gold, or a peculiar shade of orange that seemed to exist only in the 60s. And then there were the novelty platters, made from materials that defied easy categorization, compressed cork, textured glass, something that resembled fossilized wicker. These were conversation pieces as much as serving dishes, quirky enough to comment on, functional enough to use repeatedly. Guests gathered around the chip and dip platter like it was a campfire, standing or sitting in a loose circle, reaching in periodically to scoop a chip through the dip, chatting between bites. It became the center of social interaction, a reason to move closer, a shared resource that facilitated conversation simply by requiring everyone to return to it regularly. You could not hide in a corner at a party that had a chip and dip platter. You had to engage, had to reach past someone else, had to exchange small talk while loading your chip with dip. The dips themselves were rarely complex. Onion dip was king, simple and universally liked. Its flavor strong enough to be interesting, but not so adventurous that anyone felt intimidated. Clam dip appeared occasionally, cream cheese mixed with minced clams and Worcestershire sauce, served to guests who were either delighted or horrified depending on their feelings about seafood. Guacamole was starting to appear in more cosmopolitan households, mashed avocado mixed with lime and salt, though it was still exotic enough that hostesses felt compelled to explain what it was. Children were drawn to chip and dip platters, but often disappointed by the adult flavors. Onion dip was too sharp, clam dip was too fishy, guacamole was too green and strange-looking. They ate the chips plain, grabbing handfuls from the outer ring, crunching loudly, occasionally dropping crumbs onto the carpet while parents pretended not to notice, because parties were for relaxing, not for policing children's snacking habits. And then, entertaining changed. Parties became less formal, snacking more individualized, and the chip and dip platter began to feel dated, too specific, too tied to a particular era's idea of hospitality. People served chips in bags, let guests scoop dip straight from the container, or abandoned chips entirely in favor of vegetable trays and cheese cubes. The platters were packed away, stored in basements, donated to thrift stores where they sat on shelves waiting for someone nostalgic enough to buy them. But for those who remember, the chip and dip platter remains a symbol of a certain kind of party, casual but intentional, friendly but structured, where the food was simple, the conversation flowed, and everyone gathered around a single platter, reaching in, dipping chips and feeling, for an evening at least, like part of something warm and welcoming. The pop-up toaster was a morning marvel, a chrome appliance that browned your bread and then launched it skyward with a cheerful spring-loaded ding. You adjusted the dial, dropped in your slices and waited, listening for that satisfying pop that meant breakfast was ready. Sometimes the toast flew too enthusiastically, landing butter side down on the floor, but that was simply part of the experience. The toaster sat on the counter, gleaming and streamlined, a small monument to American ingenuity and the belief that even toast could be improved through automation. The exterior was usually polished chrome, reflective enough to check your appearance while waiting for breakfast, though the reflection was slightly distorted and made you look shorter and wider than you actually were. 2 slots on top accepted slices of bread, and a lever on the side pushed them down into the heating chamber, where coiled wires glowed red hot. The darkness dial was your control, a numbered knob ranging from 1 to 5, sometimes higher, that determined how long the bread stayed inside. Light toast required a lower number, dark toast a higher one, and finding the perfect setting for your particular toaster was a process of trial and error that took weeks. Every toaster toasted differently, some ran hot, some ran cool, and the only way to know was to sacrifice a few slices while you calibrated. You dropped the bread in, pushed the lever down until it clicked and locked, then waited. The toaster heated quietly, the coils radiating warmth, the bread gradually changing from soft white to golden brown to, if you forgot about it, charcoal black. The smell developed slowly, first just warm bread, then toasted grain, then a more intense roasted aroma that signalled the bread was nearly done. And then, with a sharp metallic snap, the spring released and the toast launched upward, popping free of the slots with enough force to clear the top of the toaster entirely. If you were paying attention, you grabbed it mid-air or plucked it from the slot before it fell back down. If you were distracted, the toast bounced off the counter, hit the floor, or occasionally ricocheted off a nearby object in a trajectory that seemed to defy physics. The sound was distinctive, a bright mechanical ding followed by the softer thud of toast landing. It was a kitchen alarm clock, a signal that breakfast was progressing, that someone needed to stop what they were doing and retrieve the toast before it cooled, or before the cat investigated why food had suddenly appeared on the floor. Butter was applied immediately, while the toast was still hot so it melted into the surface, rather than sitting on top like cold paste. You spread it quickly, watching it disappear into the bread, then added jam if you were feeling indulgent, or just ate it plain if you were in a hurry. Hot toast tasted better than cold toast. This was universally acknowledged, and timing the butter application was crucial to maximising enjoyment. The toaster also toasted unevenly sometimes, browning one side more than the other, creating a gradient of colour from pale gold to dark brown across a single slice. This was accepted as normal, an unavoidable quirk of the technology, and you learned to flip your bread if you wanted both sides equally toasted, though most people could not be bothered and just ate it lopsided. Crumbs accumulated at the bottom of the toaster, a growing collection of blackened bread particles that eventually needed to be emptied. Some toasters had a removable tray that slid out from the base. Others required you to turn the entire appliance upside down over the sink and shake it, dislodging showers of crumbs while hoping you did not also dislodge any essential internal components. And despite its quirks, despite the occasional flying toast or unevenly browned slice, the pop-up toaster was beloved. A reliable morning companion that required minimal effort and delivered consistent results. It represented progress, the automation of a task that once required a stovetop and constant attention, now reduced to dropping bread into a slot and waiting for the pop. Because the pop-up toaster was not just about toast. It was about mornings that started smoothly, about small mechanical miracles that made life easier, about the satisfying sound of bread launching into the air, announcing that breakfast was ready and the day could finally begin. The manual meat grinder clamped to the edge of the kitchen table was a tool of both utility and mild intimidation. You fed chunks of meat into the top, cranked the handle, and watched as ground meat emerged from the other end like some kind of culinary magic trick. It required muscle, patience, and a willingness to clean about 17 small parts afterward. But it gave you control over exactly what went into your hamburger. The grinder was cast iron, heavy and substantial, with a large hopper on top where you place the meat, a hand crank on the side, and a cylindrical body that housed the grinding mechanism. At the front, a blade and grinding plate with holes determined how fine or coarse the meat would be. A screw clamp attached the whole contraption to the table edge, and you tightened it firmly because a loose grinder would wobble, shift, and potentially detach mid-grind, sending chunks of raw meat across the kitchen in a disaster no one wanted to explain. Using the grinder meant cutting meat into chunks small enough to fit through the hopper, but large enough that they still had structure. You removed bones, cartilage, and excessive fat, though some fat was necessary for flavour and moisture. Too lean, and the ground meat would be dry, crumbly, disappointing. Too fatty, and it would be greasy, shrinking dramatically when cooked, leaving puddles of rendered fat in the pan. You fed the chunks into the hopper, pushed them down gently with a wooden plunger, and cranked the handle in steady, rhythmic circles. Inside, the auger grabbed the meat and forced it toward the blade, which spun against the grinding plate, cutting the meat into smaller pieces that squeezed through the holes and emerged as ground meat, long strands that curled slightly as they dropped into the bowl below. The resistance varied depending on the meat. Beef ground easily, the muscle fibres yielding to the blade without much fight. Pork was similar, though fattier, producing a softer, stickier ground meat. Tougher cuts required more effort, more force on the crank, and occasionally the grinder jammed, clogged with gristle or sinew that the blade could not cut. When that happened, you stopped, disassembled the front, cleared the blockage, reassembled everything, and started again. The sound was rhythmic, a mechanical grinding punctuated by the squeak of the hand crank and the soft plop of ground meat hitting the bowl. It was not loud exactly, but it was pervasive, a working sound that filled the kitchen and announced that someone was making something from scratch, putting in effort, refusing to settle for pre-ground meat from the butcher. Making your own ground meat meant knowing exactly what was in it. No fillers, no mystery scraps, no additives or preservatives. Just pure meat, ground to your preferred texture, ready to be shaped into burgers, meatballs, meatloaf, or whatever the recipe demanded. It was fresher, tasted better, and gave you a sense of control that pre-ground meat could not match. But it was also labour-intensive. Grinding enough meat for a family dinner took time, took effort, and required cleaning the grinder afterward, disassembling every piece, washing each one individually, drying them thoroughly to prevent rust. The blade was sharp, the grinding plate had dozens of small holes that trapped bits of meat, and the auger had grooves where fat and tissue like to hide. Cleaning was tedious, necessary, and not something you looked forward to after already spending 20 minutes cranking the handle. And then pre-ground meat became more reliable, more readily available, and cheaper than buying whole cuts to grind yourself. Supermarkets sold it in neat packages, already ground, already portioned, ready to cook. The convenience was undeniable, and gradually the meat grinder saw less use, was cleaned and stored away, eventually forgotten in the back of a cabinet or the bottom of a basement storage box. But for those who used it, the meat grinder remains a memory of intentional cooking, of standing at the table cranking the handle, watching the meat transform from chunks to ground, knowing that tonight's dinner was made with care, with effort, with the kind of attention that modern convenience has made optional, but that once felt essential to feeding a family well. The Lazy Susan spun lazily in the centre of your dining table, or inside your cupboard, rotating to bring condiments, spices or snacks within easy reach. It was convenience disguised as a small rotating platform, and it made everything feel just a little bit fancier. You gave it a gentle push, it glided smoothly, and suddenly the mustard was right in front of you without anyone having to ask you to pass it. The Lazy Susan was usually circular, made from wood, plastic or occasionally metal, sitting on a ball-bearing mechanism that allowed it to rotate with minimal effort. On the dining table it held the essentials: salt and pepper shakers, a bottle of ketchup, a jar of pickles, maybe a small dish of butter or a basket of rolls. Everything was arranged in a circle, accessible from any seat at the table, No reaching required, no need to interrupt conversation to request something that was sitting just out of reach on the other side. The beauty of the Lazy Susan was its democracy. Everyone at the table had equal access to everything on the platform. No one person controlled the condiments. No one had to act as gatekeeper, passing things around, remembering who asked for what. You simply rotated the platform until what you wanted was in front of you, took it, used it, returned it, and spun the platform away for the next person. It was self-serve dining at its most elegant, a solution to a problem so subtle most people had not realized it existed until the Lazy Susan solved it. In the cupboard, the Lazy Susan served a different purpose, organizing spices, canned goods, or jars that would otherwise be difficult to access in deep, dark cabinet corners. You installed it on a shelf, loaded it with items, and suddenly everything was visible. Everything was reachable with a simple spin. No more digging through stacked cans to find the tomato paste hiding in the back. No more knocking over bottles while searching for the vanilla extract. Just spin, locate, grab, done. The motion was satisfying, smooth and effortless, requiring just a light touch to set it in motion. Children loved spinning the Lazy Susan faster and faster, watching the condiments blur into a colourful circle, testing how fast they could make it go before centrifugal force sent something flying off the edge. Parents tolerated this briefly before issuing warnings about wasting food and breaking glass jars, at which point the spinning slowed to more reasonable, adult-approved speeds. The name itself was unfortunate, a relic of an era with different sensibilities, and over time people began calling it a turntable or a rotating server, or simply the spinning thing in the middle of the table, avoiding the problematic original name while still using the device. But the function remained unchanged, a rotating platform that made shared meals easier and cupboards more organised. Lazy Susans came in many styles. Simple wooden ones with a plain finish. Nothing fancy, just functional. Decorative ones with painted designs, flowers or geometric patterns that matched the kitchen decor. Two-tiered versions that doubled the storage space. Useful for cupboards but awkward on the dining table, where they blocked sight lines and made conversation difficult across the table. Some families used their Lazy Susan every day, loading it with breakfast condiments in the morning, lunch fixings at noon, and dinner necessities in the evening. Others used it only for special occasions, holidays, or when company came over, the rest of the time leaving it empty or using it to display a centerpiece, a bowl of fruit, or a small vase of flowers. And then dining habits changed. Families ate together less frequently, meals became less formal, and condiments migrated from shared serving pieces to individual squeeze bottles and pump dispensers that people grabbed from the refrigerator as needed. The Lazy Susan lost its purpose, or at least its primary purpose, and became more decorative than functional, a place to display items rather than to serve them. But for those who used it, the Lazy Susan remains a memory of shared meals, of tables where everything was within reach, of the gentle spin that brought ketchup or pickles or butter right to you without asking, without waiting, without interrupting the conversation, that made dinner more than just eating, that made it time spent together. By the mid-60s, kitchens were awash in avocado green appliances, from refrigerators to blenders to toasters. This colour was everywhere, bold, optimistic, and utterly convinced it represented the future. These appliances hummed, whirred and churned in their cheerful green casings, filling kitchens with both functionality and a very specific aesthetic that would eventually become a punchline but was, at the time, the height of modern design. Avocado green was not a subtle colour. It was deep, saturated, somewhere between the flesh of an avocado and the exterior of a particularly ambitious lime. It dominated the space it occupied, impossible to ignore, making white appliances look boring by comparison, and chrome appliances look cold and clinical. Avocado green said you were modern, forward-thinking, unafraid of colour, willing to commit to a design trend with the confidence of someone who believed the 1960s would last forever. The colour appeared on everything. Refrigerators stood tall in avocado green, their rounded corners and chrome handles gleaming. Ranges matched, their ovens and stovetops offering cooking power wrapped in optimistic colour. Dishwashers, when people had them, came in avocado green, their fronts blending seamlessly with the rest of the kitchen. Smaller appliances followed: toasters, blenders, mixers, even electric can openers, all available in avocado green for those who wanted a coordinated kitchen where every surface, every appliance, every detail reinforced the same bold aesthetic choice. The appeal was partly psychological. Avocado green felt natural, organic, connected to the earth and growing things even though it was applied to metal and plastic machines. It felt less industrial than stainless steel, less sterile than white, warmer and more inviting than any colour that had come before. It suggested that your kitchen was not just a workplace, but a living space, a room where nature and technology could coexist in harmony. It also felt luxurious. Avocado green appliances cost the same as white or pale yellow appliances, but they seemed more expensive, more special, like you'd made a deliberate choice rather than simply accepting whatever the manufacturer offered. Owning a full set of avocado green appliances was a status symbol, proof that you had purchased everything recently, that you were keeping up with trends, that your kitchen was current and stylish. The colour coordinated well with other popular 60s choices: harvest gold countertops, burnt orange cabinets, brown and beige floor tiles. These all played nicely with avocado green, creating colour schemes that felt cohesive even if they now seemed slightly hallucinogenic. The overall effect was warm, earthy, busy, a kitchen that announced its era the moment you walked in. But avocado green had a fatal flaw. It was a trend, and trends end. By the early 70s, the colour began to feel dated, too tied to a specific moment, too bold for changing tastes that were moving toward neutrals and earth tones that were actually neutral rather than aggressively green. Homeowners who had committed to avocado green appliances found themselves stuck, unable to afford replacing everything, watching as their once modern kitchen slowly transformed into a time capsule. And then avocado green became a joke, shorthand for outdated design, a colour that marked your kitchen as hopelessly behind the times. Real estate listings mentioned avocado green appliances as a negative, something that would need to be replaced, a strike against the home's value. The colour that once represented the future became a symbol of the past, and not in a nostalgic, charming way, but in an embarrassing, why did anyone think this was a good idea way? But for those who lived with avocado green appliances when they were new, when they were exciting, the colour remains a memory of optimism, of kitchens that felt alive and intentional, of a time when people believed that design mattered, that colour could transform a space, that even something as ordinary as a refrigerator could be beautiful if you just gave it the right shade of green. Your mother kept a recipe box on the counter, a small wooden or metal container filled with index cards covered in her handwriting. These cards held family secrets, tried and true recipes, and the occasional clipping from a magazine. You flipped through them carefully, reading her notes in the margins, adjusting ingredient amounts, following her instructions as if she were standing right beside you, guiding you through every step. The recipe box was personal, in a way that cookbooks never quite managed. The cards inside were not professionally printed or photographed beautifully. They were handwritten, sometimes in careful script, sometimes in rush scrawl, recording recipes as they were taught, passed down, adapted over years of repetition. Ingredient lists were straightforward, measurements approximate, instructions brief, because the person who wrote them assumed you already knew the basics and just needed reminders about proportions and timing. Some cards were stained, splattered with batter or sauce from the times they were propped against the flour canister during active cooking. These stains were badges of honour, proof that the recipe had been made repeatedly, that it worked, that it was worth keeping. A pristine card might be untested, experimental, something copied down but never attempted. A stained card was a guarantee. The handwriting told stories. Your mother's careful cursive on cards from her early marriage, when she was still learning to cook, still following recipes exactly, not yet confident enough to improvise. Your grandmother's spidery script on older cards, some of them yellowed and fragile, holding recipes that stretched back generations. Occasionally a card in someone else's handwriting entirely, a neighbour's recipe for banana bread, a sister-in-law's famous casserole, recorded and filed away after a dinner party where you asked for the recipe and she wrote it down on the spot. The organisation varied. Some boxes were meticulously organised, dividers separating desserts from main dishes from side dishes, alphabetised within categories, easy to navigate. Others were chaotic, cards stuffed in randomly, recipes for cookies mixed with recipes for pot roast, no system at all except familiarity, knowing roughly where things were based on muscle memory and repetition. The recipe box sat on the counter or a shelf, always within reach, referred to almost daily. You consulted it when planning meals, when grocery shopping, when someone requested a favourite dish, and you could not quite remember if it needed 2 eggs or 3. You pulled cards out, propped them up while cooking, returned them when finished, gradually adding your own grease stains, your own notes, your own history, to cards that already carried decades of kitchen wisdom. Some recipes had notes in the margins, tiny observations that made the difference between success and failure. Bake 5 minutes less. Double the vanilla. Do not overmix or it gets tough. These annotations were gifts from past cooks, lessons learned through trial and error, recorded so future cooks would not have to repeat the same mistakes. Children inherited recipe boxes, receiving them as wedding gifts or, when setting up their first kitchens, small wooden boxes packed with cards that represented their mother's or grandmother's entire cooking knowledge. They treasured them, not just for the recipes, but for the handwriting, for the stains, for the physical connection to family members who might no longer be alive but whose presence lingered in every card, every note, every stained corner that proved this recipe had fed people who mattered. And then cookbooks became more accessible. Cooking websites appeared. Recipes became searchable, and the recipe box began to feel quaint, inefficient, limited. Why flip through cards when you could search online and find hundreds of variations instantly? Why copy recipes by hand when you could print them or save them digitally, organising them in folders that took up no physical space? The recipe boxes were tucked away, stored in closets or attics, their cards preserved but unused, the handwriting fading slowly as ink aged and paper yellowed. But they were never thrown away, because throwing away a recipe box felt like erasing history, discarding the physical evidence of meals cooked, families fed, traditions maintained. Because recipe boxes were not really about recipes. They were about continuity, about the hands that wrote the cards, about kitchens where these dishes were made, about the people who gathered around tables and ate together, about the knowledge passed down through generations, not in formal lessons, but in handwritten cards that said, "This is how we make this. This is what we eat. This is who we are." The handheld electric mixer was lighter, more portable, and far easier to clean than its stand mixer cousin. You gripped it firmly, pressed the button, and guided it through batter, frosting, or mashed potatoes, feeling the vibration travel up your arm. It was not as powerful as the big mixers, but it was nimble, quick, and perfect for small jobs that did not require industrial strength. The mixer had 2 beaters, chrome wire loops that spun at variable speeds controlled by a dial or a series of buttons on the handle. Low speed for folding ingredients gently, high speed for whipping cream or beating egg whites into stiff peaks. The motor hummed loudly when you pressed the trigger, a high-pitched whir that announced to everyone in the house that baking was happening, that someone was making something that required mechanical assistance. You held it with one hand, steadying the bowl with the other, guiding the beaters through the mixture in slow circles, making sure to scrape the bottom and sides where flour liked to hide. The beaters rotated quickly, blurring into silver spirals, and if you lifted them too high while they were still spinning, you sent droplets of batter flying across the counter, the cabinets, occasionally your face. Learning to turn off the mixer before lifting the beaters was a lesson everyone learned exactly once, usually while wearing their good clothes. The cord was always slightly too short, requiring you to stand close to the outlet or use an extension cord, and it had a tendency to wrap around your arm as you worked, a minor annoyance that you untangled periodically without much thought. The mixer got warm during extended use, the motor heating up until the plastic casing felt uncomfortably hot against your palm, but it kept working, kept spinning, kept doing its job until you released the button and the beaters coasted to a stop. Children begged to lick the beaters when you finished mixing, a privilege granted only after the mixer was unplugged and the beaters removed, because no one trusted a 7-year-old not to accidentally hit the power button while licking raw cake batter off chrome wire. You handed over the beaters carefully, watching as small tongues navigated the twisted metal, trying to reach every crevice where chocolate or vanilla batter clung stubbornly. Cleaning the handheld mixer was straightforward. You pressed the eject button on the side and the beaters popped free, usually with a soft click and a faint resistance that required a gentle tug. You washed them in the sink, warm soapy water dissolving the dried batter, then dried them and stored them back in the mixer's base, or tucked them into a drawer. The mixer body itself needed only a quick wipe with a damp cloth, careful to avoid getting water near the motor vents. The handheld mixer lived in a cabinet or a drawer, easily accessible, ready to be pulled out whenever a recipe required mixing, that was too tedious to do by hand but too small to justify dragging out the stand mixer. It was the middle ground, the practical choice, the tool that got used most often, because it was easy, because it was fast, because it did not require setup or significant cleanup. Some mixers came with additional attachments, dough hooks for kneading bread, whisks for aerating egg whites, but most people stuck with the standard beaters, the ones that came with the mixer, the ones that work for 90% of tasks. Specialized attachments required storage space, required remembering they existed, and most households had neither the space nor the inclination to complicate something that already worked perfectly well. The handheld mixer excelled at specific tasks. Mashed potatoes became smoother, fluffier, transformed from lumpy disappointment into creamy perfection with just a few minutes of mixing. Cake batters came together quickly, the beaters incorporating ingredients faster than any wooden spoon could manage. Frosting whipped into glossy peaks, ready to spread across cooled cakes. Cookie dough, however, was a challenge. The thick mixture strained the motor, made the beaters slow, threatened to burn out the mechanism if you pushed too hard. For cookies, many people returned to mixing by hand, saving the mixer for lighter work. The sound of the handheld mixer became part of the kitchen's acoustic landscape, as familiar as the percolator's bubbling or the oven timer's ring. When you heard that high-pitched whir, You knew someone was baking, that something sweet was being created, that in an hour or so there would be cookies or cake or frosting to taste. Children appeared in the kitchen doorway when they heard it, drawn by the promise of batter-coated beaters to lick. The mixer also revealed the baker's skill level. Experienced bakers moved confidently, adjusting speed without thinking, knowing exactly when to stop mixing to avoid overworking the batter. Novice bakers hesitated, frequently checking the recipe, uncertain whether the mixture was smooth enough or mixed too much, learning through trial and error the difference between properly beaten and overbeaten. And despite its limitations, despite being less powerful than stand mixers, despite the cord that was always too short and the motor that overheated during extended use, the handheld mixer earned its place in American kitchens. It was practical, affordable, and sufficient for most home baking needs. It required no dedicated counter space, no significant investment, no commitment beyond the willingness to hold it steady and guide it through batter. The handheld mixer was not glamorous. It did not sit on the counter looking impressive like a stand mixer with its shiny bowl and professional appearance. It was a tool, purely functional, and it lived its life hidden away until needed, then emerged briefly, did its job efficiently, and returned to storage without fanfare. But it was reliable, and in a kitchen where reliability mattered more than aesthetics, where meals needed to be made quickly and efficiently without unnecessary complications, the handheld mixer earned its place. One batch of cookies, one bowl of mashed potatoes, one cake batter at a time, spinning away with its distinctive whir, helping hands that were willing to work but grateful for mechanical assistance that made the work faster, easier, just a little bit less exhausting. It bridged the gap between manual labour and full automation, offering just enough help to make baking manageable without completely removing the human element, the guidance, the attention, the care that turned ingredients into something worth sharing with the people you loved. The dish drainer sat beside the sink, a wire rack where plates, glasses and silverware rested after washing, dripping quietly into the tray below. It was utilitarian, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. You washed, you rinsed, you placed each item carefully in the rack, and then you waited for gravity and air to do the rest. Dishwashers were still rare in the 60s, so this humble rack did the work that machines would later claim. The dish drainer was usually made of coated wire, plastic-covered or rubber-dipped to prevent rust and protect dishes from scratching. The rack had slots for plates standing upright at an angle, so water ran down and off, rather than pooling in concave surfaces. A separate compartment held cups and glasses upside down, draining from the rim. A small basket or section corralled silverware, forks and spoons standing handle up, knives placed carefully so no one reached in and grabbed a blade. Beneath the rack sat a tray, shallow and rectangular, catching the water that dripped from freshly washed dishes. The tray needed emptying regularly, carried carefully to the sink and tipped, water sloshing out in a rush. If you forgot to empty it, the tray overflowed, water spreading across the counter, seeping under canisters and appliances, creating puddles that required towels and mild cursing to address. Using the dish drainer required strategy. You washed in a logical order, starting with glasses and cups, moving to plates and bowls, finishing with pots and pans. You placed items in the drainer as you worked, fitting them together like a puzzle, maximizing space, ensuring nothing blocked airflow to items behind it. A poorly loaded drainer meant dishes stayed wet longer, meant having to rearrange mid-wash, meant frustration over wasted effort. Plates stood in their slots, leaning at identical angles, lined up like soldiers. Glasses nestled between them, tucked into gaps, balanced carefully so they would not tip. Large bowls posed problems, taking up excessive space, blocking smaller items, sometimes requiring their own separate drying area on a dish towel spread across the counter. Pots and pans were the worst, too large for the drainer, too awkward to balance, usually ending up hand-dried with a towel simply because there was nowhere else to put them. The dish drainer was always visible, always present, a permanent fixture on the counter beside the sink. It was never empty, or almost never, because doing dishes was a continuous process. 3 meals a day plus snacks, cups of coffee, glasses of water, always something needing to be washed, always something dripping dry in the rack. The drainer became part of the kitchen landscape, accepted, ignored, noticed only when it was overflowing, and you needed to put away dry dishes to make room for the next batch. Children were assigned dish duty, washing or drying, or both depending on age and trustworthiness. Washing meant standing at the sink, hands in soapy water, scrubbing plates and rinsing them under the tap. Drying meant pulling items from the drainer, wiping them with a cotton dish towel until they were dry enough to put away. Some families insisted on drying everything immediately. Others let dishes air dry overnight, putting them away in the morning when everything was completely dry and water spots had evaporated. The dish drainer revealed household habits. A drainer full of coffee cups meant someone was home during the day, drinking multiple cups, not bothering to reuse the same mug. A drainer full of small plates and bowls meant children were home, snacking frequently, leaving a trail of dishes. An empty drainer meant either no one was cooking or someone was compulsively staying on top of dishes, washing and putting away immediately, maintaining order through vigilance. Watermarks developed on the tray over time, mineral deposits from tap water that dried and left white residue. The wire rack developed rust spots where the coating wore through, usually at stress points where plates rested or where you gripped the rack to move it. These imperfections were cosmetic, not functional, and most people ignored them, continuing to use the drainer until it literally fell apart or until they moved and left it behind for the next tenant. The rhythm of the dish drainer was the rhythm of the household itself. Breakfast dishes appeared, dried, disappeared into cabinets. Lunch dishes followed the same pattern. Dinner dishes, the largest load, filled the drainer completely, sometimes requiring 2 shifts, washing half, putting away, then washing the rest. The drainer was a barometer of household activity, empty when no one was home, overflowing during holidays when extended family gathered and every dish in the house saw use. Some drainers were more elaborate, featuring multiple tiers, separate compartments for different types of dishes, built-in utensil holders with drainage holes. Others were basic, simple wire frames with minimal organization, requiring the user to impose order through careful placement. The fancier versions cost more but did not necessarily work better. Dishes dried at the same rate regardless of how organized the rack appeared. The dish drainer also participated in small household dramas. A glass placed carelessly tipped and fell, shattering in the sink or on the counter. A plate balanced improperly slid forward and chipped against the faucet. Silverware fell through gaps and had to be fished out of the tray below. These minor disasters were part of life with the drainer, accepted risks of a system that required human attention and care. And then dishwashers became standard, built into kitchens, affordable, common enough that most households had one. The dish drainer became optional, unnecessary, used only when the dishwasher was full or broken, or when hand washing something delicate that could not survive the harsh spray and high heat. It shrank, was tucked away in a cabinet, emerged only occasionally, no longer the essential tool it once was. But for those who used it daily, who washed every dish by hand, who stood at the sink 3 times a day loading the drainer, it remains a memory of a slower rhythm, of work that was visible, tangible, repetitive but necessary, of watching water drip slowly from clean dishes, of the satisfaction of an empty drainer and a full cabinet, of a kitchen where nothing was automated, nothing was hidden, and cleanliness required effort, attention, and a wire rack that did its job quietly, patiently, without complaint, day after day, meal after meal, year after year, holding dishes while they surrendered their water and became ready to serve again. Inside the percolator lived a small metal basket, a filter that held the coffee grounds while boiling water bubbled up through them, extracting flavour in a process that was equal parts science and hope. You measured your grounds carefully, snapped the basket into place, and trusted the machine to do the rest. When the percolating slowed and the aroma filled the kitchen, you knew it was ready, strong, hot, and utterly essential. The basket was cylindrical, made of aluminum or tin, perforated with small holes that allowed water to flow through while trapping the coffee grounds inside. It sat on a hollow tube that rose from the bottom of the percolator, and when the water below boiled, pressure forced it up through the tube, where it sprayed over the coffee grounds in the basket, dripping back down through the holes as freshly brewed coffee. Measuring the coffee was more art than science. The official recommendation was 1 tablespoon per cup, but cups were ambiguous. Percolator cups were smaller than standard measuring cups, and everyone had their own preference for strength. Some people used heaping tablespoons, creating coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Others used level tablespoons, producing something milder, more approachable. You adjusted based on experience, on how the last pot turned out, on whether you needed coffee to function or just coffee to accompany breakfast. The basket needed to be clean, completely clean, because old coffee grounds left behind turned rancid, adding bitter, stale flavours to fresh pots. You rinsed it after each use, dumping the wet grounds into the trash, running water through the perforations until no brown residue remained. Grounds were stubborn, clinging to the metal, hiding in the holes, requiring a brush or your fingers to dislodge them completely. The basket also had a lid, a small perforated cap that sat on top, keeping the grounds contained during the violent bubbling of the percolation process. Without the lid, grounds escaped, floating into the coffee below, creating a gritty, unpleasant texture that no amount of sugar or cream could mask. The lid was easy to lose, small enough to slip behind the counter or fall into the sink disposal, and replacing it often meant ordering a new part or simply holding the basket down with a spoon during brewing, improvising a solution that worked but felt precarious. Installing the basket required attention. You placed it on the tube, ensuring it sat level, that the tube poked up through the centre hole properly, that nothing was crooked or misaligned. A poorly seated basket meant coffee grounds in your pot, meant having to strain the coffee through a cloth or simply drink it gritty and complain quietly about the inconvenience. The percolator basket defined the coffee's strength more than anything else. Too few grounds and the water passed through without extracting much flavour, producing pale, weak coffee that tasted like regret. Too many grounds and the water could not circulate properly, producing sludge, over-extracted bitterness, something closer to punishment than beverage. Finding the right amount meant experimenting, paying attention, remembering what worked and repeating it. Some people reused coffee grounds, adding fresh grounds on top of yesterday's, stretching their coffee budget by extracting every possible bit of flavour. The result was weak, thin coffee with strange undertones, but during lean times it was better than no coffee at all. Most people, though, used fresh grounds every time, accepting that coffee was an expense worth paying for, a small daily luxury that made mornings bearable. The basket aged along with the percolator, developing stains, losing its shine, occasionally denting if dropped or handled roughly. But it kept working, kept holding grounds, kept producing coffee, year after year, pot after pot, morning after morning. It was replaceable, technically, but most people kept the same basket for the life of the percolator, a small metal component that never broke, never wore out, just gradually accumulated the patina of use. The morning ritual centered around this basket. You measured the grounds, sometimes by tablespoon, sometimes by eye, if you had been making coffee long enough to gauge amounts without measuring. You tapped the basket gently to settle the grounds, creating an even layer that water would flow through uniformly. You placed the perforated lid on top, pressing it down gently to ensure it sat flat. Then you lowered the basket onto the tube inside the pot, checking that everything aligned properly before closing the main lid and plugging in the machine, and then you waited. The percolator did its work, heating water, forcing it up through the tube, spraying it over the grounds, repeating the cycle until the coffee reached the desired strength. You could watch the process through the glass knob on the lid, amber liquid bubbling up, darkening gradually as more flavour extracted from the grounds. When the colour looked right, you unplugged the machine and let it rest, allowing the last of the water to cycle through before pouring. The basket held the key to good coffee. A clean basket meant pure flavour, nothing interfering with the taste of the beans. Proper filling meant balanced extraction, not too weak, not too bitter. Correct placement meant no grounds escaping into the pot, no grit at the bottom of your cup. The basket was simple, almost primitive in its design, but it performed its function reliably day after day, asking nothing except occasional cleaning and proper use. And when the percolator was finally retired, replaced by drip coffee makers with paper filters and programmable timers, the basket was discarded along with it, tossed into the trash or donated with the percolator to a thrift store. It had no use outside its original machine, no purpose beyond holding coffee grounds while water bubbled through them. But for those who used it, who measured grounds into that metal basket every morning, who snapped it into place and listened for the percolator's bubbling song, the basket remains a small but essential memory, a humble component of a morning ritual, a reminder that good coffee required not just beans and water, but the right tools, the right process, the right attention to detail that transformed simple ingredients into something that made the day feel possible, that bridged the gap between sleep and wakefulness, that provided the first warmth and the first comfort of every single morning, reliable as sunrise, necessary as breath. Every table had salt and pepper shakers, often matching, sometimes whimsical, always within reach. These were not just functional. They were decorative, part of the table setting, part of the ritual. You shook them lightly over your eggs, your potatoes, your evening roast, adding flavour in small bursts. They sat beside the napkin holder, the butter dish, and the sugar bowl, a quartet of essentials that marked every meal. The shakers came in pairs, identical except for the number of holes in the top. Salt had more holes, pepper had fewer, though some households reversed this and heated debates occasionally erupted over which was correct. The holes determined flow, how much seasoning came out with each shake, and you learned your shaker's particular personalities, how hard to shake for a light dusting, how vigorously to shake for generous coverage. Materials varied. Glass shakers were common, clear or coloured, often with metal tops that screwed on and occasionally corroded from moisture. Ceramic shakers were popular, glazed and decorative, shaped like chickens or vegetables or abstract mid-century forms that looked vaguely atomic. Plastic shakers were lighter, cheaper, practical for households with children who knocked things over regularly. Some shakers had cork bottoms that you pulled out to refill them. Others had small pour spouts covered by flip-up lids. Refilling the shakers was a small household chore, usually noticed only when you shook one vigorously and nothing came out. You unscrewed the top or pulled the bottom plug, tilted the salt or pepper container over the opening, and poured carefully, trying not to overfill, trying not to spill. Salt was forgiving, easy to pour, easy to clean up if you missed. Pepper was trickier, lighter, more likely to puff into the air and make you sneeze, coating the counter in fine black dust that required a damp cloth to remove. The shakers developed personalities over time. The salt shaker's holes sometimes clogged in humid weather, requiring a toothpick to clear them, or a few grains of rice added to absorb moisture and keep the salt flowing freely. The pepper shaker's mechanism wore out from constant shaking, the top loosening until it threatened to fall off mid-shake, sending a pile of pepper onto someone's dinner plate in a minor catastrophe that was funny only in retrospect. Salt and pepper were the most democratic of seasonings, available to everyone at the table, no asking required. You reached for them without thinking, seasoned your food to your own taste, passed them to someone else who reached. They circulated constantly during meals, handed across the table, set down, picked up, handed again. A quiet choreography that happened without discussion or direction. Some families had special shakers for holidays, fancier versions that replaced the everyday ones for Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, silver-plated shakers, crystal shakers, antique shakers inherited from grandparents, brought out to make the table look more formal, more special, more worthy of the occasion. The everyday shakers were tucked away temporarily, then returned to duty once the holiday dishes were washed and put away. Children were fascinated by salt and pepper shakers, by the way the contents moved when you shook them, by the patterns the holes made, by the satisfying sound of shaking. They shook too enthusiastically, creating small mountains of salt or pepper on their plates, then looked up with innocent expressions that suggested they had no idea how that happened. Parents sighed, redistributed the excess seasoning, reminded everyone to use gentle shakes, and accepted that children learning to season their own food meant occasional over-seasoning. The shakers also revealed preferences. A salt shaker that emptied faster than the pepper shaker meant someone in the household was a heavy salter, adding it liberally to everything. A pepper shaker that ran out first meant someone loved pepper, preferred its sharp bite to salt's straightforward enhancement. Balanced consumption suggested either moderation or multiple people, with different preferences averaging out to equilibrium. Salt and pepper shakers were also conversation pieces when they were decorative or unusual. Shakers shaped like corn cobs or tomatoes prompted comments from guests. Matching sets in particular colours or patterns became part of the kitchen's aesthetic identity. Some people collected them, displaying dozens of pairs on shelves or in cabinets, each set representing a different place visited or a different era of design. The shakers required minimal maintenance, occasional washing to remove the greasy film that accumulated from kitchen air and handling, periodic refilling, which happened more often for salt than pepper because salt was used more heavily in most households, checking that the holes were not clogged, that the tops screwed on properly, that the bottoms did not leak if that was how they were designed. And those salt and pepper shakers were small, simple, unremarkable objects. They were present at every meal, part of the table's landscape, as expected as plates and forks. They were there when you ate breakfast alone, when you gathered for Sunday dinner, when you celebrated holidays, when you sat together in the kitchen late at night eating leftovers and talking about nothing important. This sound of shaking became part of the meal's rhythm. The soft rattle of salt crystals inside glass, the quieter rustle of ground pepper, the gentle percussion of someone seasoning their food, adjusting flavours, making the meal their own. These sounds mixed with conversation, with the clink of silverware, with all the other small noises that made a meal more than just eating, that made it time spent together. Because salt and pepper shakers were not really about seasoning. They were about autonomy, about everyone having access to what they needed, about the small democratic gesture of saying season your food however you like, however it tastes good to you, however makes this meal yours. They were about the table as a shared space where preferences were respected, where no one had to eat food seasoned only to someone else's taste, where the simple act of reaching for salt or pepper was an assertion of individual choice within the structure of communal eating, a small freedom exercised 3 times a day, every day, year after year, meal after meal, until the shakers themselves became invisible, noticed only in their absence, essential only when they were missing, taken for granted precisely because they were always there, always ready, always offering their simple gift of letting you make your food taste exactly the way you wanted it to taste. Wax paper came in a box with a serrated edge, and you tore off sheets to wrap sandwiches, line cake pans or cover leftovers before plastic wrap became the standard. The paper was smooth, slightly shiny, and smelled faintly of the wax that coated it. You pulled, you tore, you folded, and you trusted this simple material to keep your food fresh and your counters clean. It was humble, reliable, and utterly forgettable until the moment you needed it. The box sat in a drawer or a cabinet, rectangular and sturdy, with the roll of wax paper inside feeding through a slot in the top. The serrated edge was sharp enough to cut the paper, but not sharp enough to cut you. A clever design that worked perfectly when you pulled straight and tore decisively, but produced ragged, uneven edges when you hesitated or pulled at an angle. Using wax paper required a specific technique. You gripped the box with one hand, held the paper with the other, pulled out the length you needed, then pressed the paper against the serrated edge and pulled sharply downward. When done correctly, the paper tore cleanly with a satisfying ripping sound. When done incorrectly, the paper tore at an angle, or halfway, or not at all, requiring a second attempt and mild frustration. Wax paper was moisture resistant, which made it perfect for wrapping sandwiches. You placed the sandwich in the centre of a sheet, folded the sides over, tucked the ends underneath, and created a neat package that kept the bread from drying out and prevented mayonnaise or mustard from leaking onto the lunch bag. Children carried these wrapped sandwiches to school, unwrapping them at lunch, smoothing the paper flat to use as a disposable plate, then wadding it up and throwing it away when finished. The paper was also heat-resistant to a point, useful for lining cake pans before pouring in batter. You tore off a sheet, pressed it into the bottom of the pan, smoothing out wrinkles, trimming the edges if they stuck up too high. The wax prevented cakes from sticking, allowed them to release cleanly when turned out onto cooling racks, and made cleanup easier because the pan stayed relatively clean underneath. Wax paper covered leftovers before plastic wrap and aluminum foil became standard. You placed a sheet over the top of a bowl, tucked the edges under, and stored it in the refrigerator. It was not airtight, not perfectly sealed, but it kept food covered, kept odours contained reasonably well, kept things from drying out overnight. It was a temporary solution, meant for short-term storage, and it worked well enough for what it was meant to do. The paper had limitations. It was not heat-safe for baking directly on it in the oven. The wax would melt, smoke, create a mess. It was not strong enough to wrap heavy or sharp items without tearing. It was not reusable. Once you unwrap something, the paper was crumpled, creased, often torn, destined for the trash. But within its limitations, it was remarkably useful, solving dozens of small kitchen problems with minimal cost and effort. The smell of wax paper was distinctive, a clean, slightly chemical scent that mixed with whatever food it wrapped, becoming part of the sensory memory of packed lunches and afternoon snacks. Children associated that smell with sandwiches made by their mothers, with lunches eaten at school desks, with the ritual of unwrapping and discovering what was inside. Wax paper also protected countertops during messy kitchen work. You rolled out pie dough on a sheet of wax paper, preventing sticking and making cleanup easier. You kneaded bread dough on it. You arranged cookies on it before transferring them to baking sheets. The paper was disposable, which meant you could use it generously, tearing off large sheets without worry, throwing them away when they became too flour-covered or dough-stuck to continue using. The serrated edge on the box wore out eventually, dulling from repeated use until it could no longer cut the paper cleanly. When that happened, you used a knife or scissors to cut the paper instead, or you simply bought a new box and transferred the old roll into it, reclaiming the sharp edge and extending the paper's useful life. Some wax paper boxes had a small illustration or instruction on the side showing proper tearing technique, a diagram of hands pulling the paper and pressing it against the edge. These illustrations were rarely needed. The process was intuitive enough that most people figured it out through trial and error, but they remained printed on boxes anyway, a vestige of instructional design from an era when manufacturers assumed their customers needed guidance for even simple tasks. Wax paper rolls depleted slowly, sheet by sheet, sandwich by sandwich, cake by cake, until you pulled and found yourself near the end of the roll, the paper coming off the cardboard core reluctantly, the last few sheets always slightly more difficult to tear cleanly. You used what remained, then pulled the empty core out and threw the whole box away, making a mental note to add wax paper to the grocery list. And then plastic wrap arrived, offering better sealing, better protection, better cling. Wax paper lost its dominance, relegated to specific tasks that plastic wrap could not handle, like lining pans or protecting counters when rolling dough. It remained available, still useful, but no longer the default choice, no longer the first thing you reached for when you needed to wrap or cover something. The transition happened gradually. Plastic wrap appeared in stores cheaper than expected, more effective than anticipated. People tried it, liked the way it clung to bowls and dishes, appreciated the tighter seal. They bought it again. Wax paper stayed in the drawer but got used less frequently. Eventually it became optional, something you kept around for specific purposes, but not something you relied on daily. But for those who grew up with it, who tore sheets daily, who wrapped thousands of sandwiches, who smoothed it into cake pans and covered bowls and unrolled it across counters, wax paper remains a memory of simpler materials, of kitchens where you made do with what was available, where every tool had a purpose and every material earned its place through reliability, through usefulness, through the quiet way it solved problems without demanding attention or praise, through the satisfying rip of paper tearing cleanly along the serrated edge, through the faint waxy smell that meant lunch was being made or a cake was being baked or something was being stored for tomorrow, through the hundreds of small moments when wax paper was exactly what was needed. Nothing more complicated, nothing more expensive, just a simple sheet of paper coated in wax, doing its job reliably, day after day, meal after meal, making kitchen work just a little bit easier, a little bit cleaner, a little bit more organized, until better materials came along and made it obsolete, but never quite made it forgotten. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your blankets, think about the kitchens we just walked through together, the percolators bubbling on counters, the flour sifters dusting the air with white powder, the recipe boxes holding handwritten cards that connected one generation to the next. These were not grand gestures. These were not moments anyone thought to preserve. They were simply mornings that arrived, afternoons that passed, evenings that ended with dishes draining quietly beside the sink. The people who lived in those kitchens did not think of themselves as living in a special time. They were just living, measuring coffee grounds, cranking egg beaters, wrapping sandwiches in wax paper, and moving through the day with a kind of steady rhythm that held families together without fanfare or applause. They did not know we would one day look back and feel nostalgia for their Tupperware, or their fondue pots, or their aluminum ice cube trays. They were just using what they had, making do, caring for the people around them in the small, unglamorous ways that never make headlines, but somehow build entire lives. Maybe tonight you carry something forward from that era. Not the products, those are gone, but the pace, the attention, the willingness to measure, to stir, to wait for the percolator to finish its song before pouring, the patience to let bread rise, to let dishes air dry, to stand at the counter a little longer because rushing does not always improve the result. History is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's a bread box, a spice rack, and someone who knew how to make dinner from what was in the cupboard. And that mattered, that still matters. So rest easy. The kitchens are quiet now. The coffee has been made, the dishes are dry, and somewhere softly, gratefully, we remember. Good night.